So now that we have a basis of how metapopulations work, let's jump into the the next level, which is metacommunities. Now, what a metacommunity is just think of it like, you know, an area, a community that is attached to another community. So a set of local communities linked by the dispersal of one or more of their constituent species. So, before we were talking about northern pike in different lakes as a metapopulation. But we can think about, then the entire fish community in different lakes as the entire metacommunity. So, what we think about when we're talking about metacommunities is it uses a lot of the same math, but just multi-species. Species are competing for vacant patches, okay? And because now we have different species, there needs to be some sort of like identifier between species, and what we're talking about is niche differences. And one way we can talk about niche differences is just reproductive differences in patches. And then there's some level of dispersal between these patches, right? So, some of these species going and finding a new spot. Now, there's some really interesting, I don't really want to get into the math about it, but there's some really interesting things that we can see based on that value A, which is that proportion dispersing. Now, what I'm talking about is like what proportion of the community is actually dispersing. So if we look back at the definition of a metacommunity, we see a set of local communities linked to the dispersal of one or more of their constituent species. So a metacommunity doesn't necessarily mean that every single species is migrating in between communities, but at least some of them are. So this dispersal level we can think about as the percentage of species, or the proportion of species in the community that are dispersing to separate areas. And what we see is we get this really weird graph here, where we see alpha diversity, beta diversity, and gamma diversity showing some weird dynamics here. And let's kind of go through and look at what happens at low, medium, and high proportions of the community dispersing. Okay, so when very few of the species in a metacommunity are actually dispersing, let's say just one or whatever, what happens is, given the theory, each patch becomes dominated by a superior competitor. Okay, so you can think of like, if species are, somewhat equivalent except their birth rates. So we're not going to be talking about like predator versus prey versus primary producer or something. But what we see is, well, I should explain that a little bit. One of the reasons why we can do that and relax those assumptions of actual reality, where we have just niche differences shown as just reproductive differences, is we can look at metacommunities of just a specific group. Maybe it's just zooplankton, where we don't really see that many differences between the zooplankton, or just bird species or something, where you don't necessarily have big niche differences between them. Now, okay, so what happens at really low proportion of the species of dispersing is that each patch essentially gets dominated by a single superior competitor. So what that means is essentially alpha diversity is like one, right? One species. But then patch A is different than patch B, so you get a slightly different species inhabiting and dominating patch B. And then you get patch C with a different species and patch D with a different species. So what we see is beta diversity is expected to be high in this scenario. Same with gamma diversity, right? The whole regional diversity would be really high because you have a bunch of these patches dominated by one species, so you have a bunch of species in the whole thing. Now, what you see is alpha then goes up and gamma and beta go down at the intermediate level. Because immigration then is essentially rescuing exclusions, right? So if you have a decent proportion of the population, or sorry, of the community going through and dispersing and migrating and immigrating all to all sorts of places, it's harder to get competitive exclusion when you have this relatively high flow of species into the habitat, which can like reset things each time a new species comes in. So you might say, well, why doesn't that continue as you get more and more of the proportion dispersing? And what happens is at these really high levels, if 100% of the species in a community disperse everywhere and can disperse between patches, really what you see is there's just a single community, right? Essentially, the community doesn't see this as a patch. So if you have, a big region here with a bunch of different patches, and if 100% of the community can go from patch to patch to patch to patch to patch and all over the place, right? Getting every patch connected. This is essentially then just becomes one patch. And it's essentially then alpha diversity is gamma diversity, and the regional competitor dominates. Since it's essentially now just one patch, whatever the best competitive species in this patch is expected to win out and basically competitively exclude everything else, and you're back to this low diversity scenario, whether we're talking about alpha, beta, or gamma here. So the question might be, does this actually happen? Like, do we see these dynamics? Particularly this, let me go back here, this curve in the alpha, because this is essentially the easiest thing to see. And some people have found this. If you look at, this is pitcher plant communities. So this is a pitcher plant here, and inside here is like a little space where rainwater fills in. The pitcher plant uses it to collect insects for nitrogen, but there's also other insects that can live in there, aquatic insects like there are certain species of Diptera, so like mosquito larvae, and then other predatory Diptera larvae that can live in these things and can actually have a whole food web. Like each individual pitcher plant has a food web. Now, what's cool about these things is they're really simple communities that we can use in these type of meta-community studies, because this is essentially then one patch, another patch, another patch, another patch, another patch. And in these communities of, in these pitcher plants, you can have potentially hundreds of replicates in a really relatively small area. And what we do see is when you look at dispersal frequency between the, essentially no to low to high dispersal frequency, we're only looking at the non-predator graphs here. What you do see is this hump shaped, and that's exactly the same as what you expect in this hump shape of the alpha diversity. But what they did find was that the predators, when you put a predator in there, you get some different dynamics. And that's not necessarily a problem per se, but it does show that, just thinking about communities in a meta-community context don't necessarily make sense. We also see this with zooplankton communities, where this person was looking at how zooplankton communities disperse, and we did see this. The different black bars mean different like taxa groups, but don't worry about that. What they did see was this that same curve that we see in that alpha diversity. And these were in zooplankton that didn't get eaten by other things. So we see that when predation comes in, you get a little different answer. So this meta-community context, when you're thinking about a community as a meta-community, what it really stresses is this migration from other places. And what we see is that meta-communities can provide kind of like a renewal, so that when you get a big forest fire or a blowdown that blows down a bunch of the forest, this if you think about it as a meta-community, what we can see is we expect some renewal, like basically individuals from nearby areas coming in to help sustain the ecosystem. So it can actually, if you think about, a forest fire or even, like continuous climate change is knocking back this diversity of, killing some species off. What meta-communities kind of, this idea is thinking, well, yes, you might get some extinctions going on, but then it's also going to add in new species, so it might go up. So we would, if a habitat has a functioning meta-community, while diversity might start to go down, meta-community dynamics can bring that diversity back up to help preserve some of that ecosystem function, in this case, productivity. So a lot of people are saying, well, how can meta-community then help us conserve things? How can it help us make decisions about how to conserve land area? And I think, from the most simple aspect about conservation, you should think of this idea as, well, we should protect as much land as possible, right? Like, if your goal is to protect native species and to have a bunch of wild habitat for organisms, animals, for hunting, for use, for watching, for bird watching, any type of use or reason that we want, you might say, well, we should protect as much land as possible. The thing is, this is a picture here of whitewater, and we just don't do that, right? We don't let nature run its course. It's a luxury we can't afford. We need to be able to think about protecting native areas. And sure, here is the Kettle Moraine forest, right? And we can see that, okay, this is at least one habitat patch where there is some amount of conservation of native, or at least wildlands, not necessarily native, but wildlands. But in the greater landscape, this is very, very little of the whole landscape. So we can't just protect as much land as possible. We need to be making decisions about how our reserves look like. And meta-community can kind of guide that a little bit. So when we think about, two contrasting ways of how to conserve land, we might think of a land sharing versus a land sparing method. Now, a land sharing perspective says have a bunch of low yield agriculture interspersed with some natural land. Okay, and you can think of this as as what's called a fine-grained meta-community. Essentially, maybe you would have a bunch of small habitat patches that seem like there, you know, some wild or at least forest that you leave alone, right? And since all these little forest patches here are pretty close to each other, and the agriculture in here isn't that intense, you would have high connectivity of all of these patches being connected to each other, right? And the opposite then is, oops, I should, let me pull these off. Okay. The opposite then is a land sparing perspective, where you have large, big areas of, intensive ag. So let's say, all of this can be cornfield, okay? And then we have a big area up here that is, so if this is all corn, this can all be forest, wild forest, okay? And there's some good things about here where you have a big area of low impact, but there's essentially no connectivity because all of this is all corn over here. We should probably make the corn spot bigger. If you have another forest over here, a big area of forest, the probability of a species getting from one forest to the other is going to be relatively low. So you have low connectivity, but you also have these bigger areas of low impact. I should have thought ahead of where I was drawing things. And the thing is, when we're thinking about how to conserve species, it really depends on what species we're talking about, the identity. So a fine-grained metacommunity is going to work perfectly fine for a squirrel, right? A little squirrel doesn't need that much, or a population of a squirrel doesn't need that big of a patch to have a totally fine population. White-tailed deer, they're even relatively big animals, but they work relatively well in high human impact areas. I'm sitting in the middle of New Jersey right now, and I see deer every day just in people's yards, grazing on the grass and people's bushes, and they do just fine in these really human dominated areas. So this fine-grained, the land sharing idea works well for some species, but does not work well for, say, a wolf, right? And we see a lot of the big predators and a lot of the white-tailed deer are kind of unique in that sense of the bigger animals like elk and moose don't do as well certainly moose don't do as well in more human dominated areas. So a land sparing strategy would be much better for a lot of those bigger predators. So when we think about conservation, when we're thinking about a meta-community, we need to ask, well, what is the goal? And a lot of people say, well, I want a really diverse fish community or something. Well, what does that diversity mean? Does it mean alpha diversity? Does it mean gamma diversity? Because those are two potentially different things, right? Do you want a single lake to have a bunch of species, or do you want your whole region to have a bunch of species? And the only way to actually manage for that is to think in a meta-community context. There's when we're thinking about managing, say, like fish communities, for example, it is, the walleye is a great example of where certain DNRs, like Wisconsin and Minnesota in particular, spend a ton of money to try to manage for walleye. And it's only a single species, but that's because fishermen spend essentially a lot of money to try to go after those fish, and they're highly sought after. And so protecting a single species is going to require a much different strategy than protecting, all of the fishes of Wisconsin. All right, with that, we'll see you later when we talk about neutral theory.